Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. In this video, I'm going to talk about seasonal differences when planting encore azaleas, meaning depending on the time of year you plant them, there might be some things that you think about a little bit differently. I did a video on how to plant encore azaleas, and that won't change. It doesn't matter what day of the year you're planting them. If you'll follow those instructions, you'll be fine. I'll link that video up here in the top if you're watching on YouTube. Let's get started with spring. What kind of things would be different when we spring plant? Spring's a great time to plant encore azaleas. It's also a great time to fertilize your trees and shrubs. So as you're planting your encore azaleas in the spring, you can actually fertilize them. And you can use any slow release fertilizer for acid loving plants. This is an acid loving plant, would be perfect. And whatever the bag recommends, from whatever you purchase. Doesn't really matter, but like I say, it is a great time to fertilize them at the exact same time. After they flower in the spring is the time of year that we do some pruning on them. My guess is that the first year you're purchasing your encore azaleas, they're probably going to have a pretty tight compact habit in the container and aren't going to really require any pruning that first year. But if there is kind of a crazy limb here or there, after they're done with their spring flowering, you can prune that off. If you're planting your encore azaleas in full flower, meaning you go to the store and you purchase them in full flower, because who wouldn't want to purchase them when they're in full flower? If you put them in the ground right away, sometimes that transplant shock can cause a little bit of fading in the flowers and shorten the flower time. So keep that in mind. If you want to really enjoy the flowers, you may want to hold off planting them for a week or so after you purchase them. Just keep them well watered and keep them in a bright place and enjoy the flowers. Because like I say, sometimes when we transplant plants in full bloom, the plant will sacrifice those flowers pretty quickly just from shock. Okay. One thing we're going to look for when we spring plant encore azaleas is that first summer they may not repeat bloom like they will in the future. It takes some time for these encore azaleas to kind of establish, the clock that they're going to be on, their spring, summer, and fall flowering schedule. And that first year, being that they're newly planted, they're not rooted in completely, they may skip that first summer flowering. That's what I have found in planting them in the past. Once they're established in the ground, they'll find that pattern and bloom very reliably for you. The other thing we're going to know about spring planting is you're going to be responsible for them that first summer. There's no way in the 6 to 8 weeks in spring before it gets very hot that they're going to be able to root out enough to be on their own that first summer. So you're going to want to keep a close eye on them that first summer. I water very heavily, and then I let them dry out between waterings. I'll come over to the bottom of them, dig around the base, see if they're moist, and if they are, I leave them alone. If they're slightly dry, saturate the entire area really, really well. Don't just water right at the base of your plant. Water out wide from it, because the soil out here is dry as well, and dry soil out here will wick the water away from your plant that you're giving it. So keep that in mind. Spring is a great time to plant, but go ahead and fertilize them. You can prune them lightly after they flower. You may want to hold off on planting them so you don't get any flower decline. And that first summer, you got a little watering to do. So let's switch over and talk about summer planting encore azaleas. The differences here are going to be, in the spring, I talked about fertilizing them when you plant them, and you can still fertilize them in the summer. We just want to switch over to a starter fertilizer. The reason for that is the regular shrub or tree fertilizer is going to have potentially a lot of nitrogen in it. That's the first number in the fertilizer, and that will push a lot of new growth. We're not going to try to push a lot of new growth on them in the summertime. So let's switch over and use a starter fertilizer, which will typically lean more toward a higher middle number phosphorus, and that's for root development. So difference in fertilizer in the summertime. Obviously, when we're summer planting anything, we're going to have to do some watering on it. Again, though, the same process of watering really heavily and then coming back and checking. And what I would do in summer planting is I'd plant it, water it in extremely well. The very next day, about the same time of day, go over to it, dig down with your finger a couple inches near the base of it. If it's moist, leave it be and come back and check it again the next day. If it's dry, drag a water hose over to it and water it extremely well. And that may set up in your mind knowing that you're going to have to water it almost daily during whatever that time of summer is until the days get shorter. But if you were able to skip a day, that's probably the pattern you're going to have. You're probably going to be able to do it every other day. Same thing if it takes 3 or 4 days. It's going to be different for everyone because your soil type's going to be different. Maybe the angle of the sun where you planted them is going to be different. Lots of differences. So find the pattern by checking them daily for a little while. And it may be that it's every third day, every fifth day. Obviously you're going to skip if it rains, and you're going to back off toward the end of the summer as the days get shorter. One other consideration for summer is you could buy an Encore azalea that's got tons of new growth on it. And if it has tons of new growth on it, when we pull it out of the container and we do some root damage on it by breaking the roots apart a little bit and in the planting process, those roots may no longer be able to supply enough water to the top of the plant. And so if you're finding that even though the soil's moist, okay, that they're still wilting a little bit in the afternoon, that the leaves are just kind of laying over a little bit, you may want to tip prune the top of that plant. Just take the top inch of each of the branches up toward the top of your plant. If you'll snip those off with a pair of sharp pruners, that will alleviate a lot of the water use that azalea has and a lot of the stress that it has. It may just be that the soil's moist, but it just doesn't have enough of a root system to supply the top of that large, vigorous growing plant. So keep that in mind. But again, to sum that up, switch over to a starter fertilizer. Find your water pattern by checking every single day. And if you need to, you can do a little bit of pruning off the top to prevent some of that afternoon wilting. So let's talk about special considerations when planting Encore azaleas in the fall. Really, there aren't any. Fall is probably the least amount of extra things you have to do. This is the time of year you can kind of dig holes, plant them, and leave them be. If you want to, you can use a starter fertilizer. Just don't use any kind of regular shrub or tree fertilizer. We definitely don't want to push any new growth on them. But if you want to use something that is just specifically for root development and shrubs and trees, and that makes you feel better, go for it. I typically don't. I'll dig a hole in the fall and just follow the planting instructions that I had in the How to Plant Encore Azalea video. And that's kind of it. I'll water it in really well, and then I'll check it in a couple days. The days are shorter that time of year. You're probably not going to have to do as much watering on them. You're definitely not going to be doing any pruning on them. We'll leave them be. Any pruning we want to do on them, we'd wait until the spring after the spring flowering. So again, don't prune them. Don't use any kind of regular shrub and tree fertilizer on them. And you know, you'll water them, but it will probably be fairly infrequently. Just go and check them occasionally. And if it's dry, again, saturate the entire area. So let's talk about winter planting Encore azaleas. Again, it's not a problem at all to plant them during the winter time. In fact, I just planted this beautiful autumn lily Encore azalea. This is a white one. It has a little purple stripe in some of the flowers. This is one of my favorites, super, super showy. You can see that from here. Again, I planted it right at the beginning of February. So what am I thinking about differently this time of year? Not a whole lot. I don't fertilize this time of year because I'm only about 6 or 8 weeks away from doing my spring fertilization. So in the winter time, I'm just going to plant them, not fertilize them, knowing that my spring shrub and tree fertilization I do in March every year. I will include the azaleas at that time. The other thing to consider is if you're planting it and then out of the blue, you get very much below normal temperatures. You know it's going to dive down into the teens or something, when normally you're at, your normal lows are up in the mid-20s or something like that. You may want to drag a sheet over to it and cover it on those nights that it's going to be that cold. They're perfectly capable of taking that kind of cold once they're established, no problem. But one that I just pulled out of the pot, tore up the roots and put into the ground, I probably don't want to put extreme cold on it right away. So again, just drag a sheet over to it. When it warms up that next morning, pull it off and go back to normal, no problem. Watering, same considerations as any other time of the year. I'm probably not going to have to water this in my area. We get a lot of rainfall in the winter time, and so I'm probably not going to have to water it, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to check it. And so every other day or so, I'll come over here, dig down a couple inches with my finger. If it needs water again, I'm going to saturate the entire area and then let it dry out again over several days. So really, in the winter time, you're just planting it and forgetting about it, and unless the temperatures really take a big dive, and then you can throw a sheet over it to protect it. Other than that, wait till spring to fertilize. So again, there's really no difference in how we plant them. If you'll follow the instructions that I had in the How to Plant Encore Azalea video, you should have great success. It's just a couple things we're going to think about after we have them in the ground, from whether or not it would be a good time of year to fertilize them, water them, whether or not we need to potentially protect them from the cold, that kind of thing. All really subtle differences. These are super easy evergreen shrubs that are extremely rewarding with very little maintenance. Thanks for watching this video.